They said she was a mistake. Until the truth came out in court. For 23 years, nobody in Gisborne knew what she was carrying, until a single pōhutukawa flower changed everything. The early morning mist rolled off Poverty Bay, as Aroha walked the quiet streets of Gisborne, her footsteps echoing softly on the wet pavement. Her woolen jumper, knitted by her grandmother decades ago, was pulled tight against the autumn chill, and against something deeper that had lived in her chest for far too long. In her weathered leather satchel, tucked between grocery receipts and old bus tickets, lay 2 items that had travelled everywhere with her for over 2 decades. A faded photograph, its edges soft from countless careful touches. And a dried pōhutukawa flower, pressed flat and brittle with age, but somehow still holding the faintest trace of crimson, still carrying the weight of a promise made between children who believed the world would always keep them safe. Aroha Taumalolo had worked at the Gisborne District Council for 8 years. She arrived before everyone else, made her tea in silence, and settled at her desk by the window that looked out toward the harbour. Her colleagues knew her as the quiet one, the woman who nodded politely but rarely joined conversations, who ate her lunch alone on the bench outside, always gazing toward the horizon, as if waiting for something to return from the sea. They whispered about her sometimes. Strange woman, that Aroha. Lives alone in that little cottage on Grey Street. Never married, no family that anyone knows of. Always seems to be looking for something, or someone. But nobody really listened to the whispers. And nobody asked why her eyes carried such weight, why she sometimes paused mid-sentence, as if hearing voices only she could recognize. The truth was, Aroha had been carrying her brother's memory like a stone in her chest since she was 14 years old. Tama had been 16 when he disappeared from their family home in Aotearoa, up the east coast. One morning he was there, helping their father fix the fence posts, joking about taking Aroha to see the pōhutukawa trees when they bloomed that summer. The next morning, gone. No note. No explanation. Just an empty bed, and a family that slowly learned to speak around the silence he left behind. Their parents had fought about it for months. Their mother, Hindwai, insisting they call the police, put up posters, search every bark and farmhouse from Gisborne to East Cape. Their father, Reuben, convinced that Tama had simply chosen to leave, that pushing too hard would only drive him further away. Boys need to find their own way, he'd said, staring out at the hills. He'll come home when he's ready. But weeks became months. Months became years. And slowly, painfully, the family learned to close around the wound Tama had left, to speak of him in past tense, to pack away his clothes, to stop setting a place for him at Sunday dinner. Everyone learned to let go, except Aroha. She'd been the last person to see him, that night before he disappeared. They'd walked down to the beach together, collecting shells and pieces of driftwood as the sun set over the Pacific. Tama had found a pōhutukawa flower that had blown down from the cliffs, still fresh and red despite the autumn wind. Here, he'd said, tucking it behind her ear. Promise me something, little sister. What? Promise me that no matter what happens, if we ever get separated, you'll never stop believing we'll find each other again. Even if everyone else gives up, even if years pass, you keep this flower, and you remember that some promises are stronger than time. She'd laughed then, thinking it was just another one of his dramatic gestures. Tama was always saying things like that, making everything sound like an adventure, like a story from one of the books he was always reading. But she'd taken the flower. And when she woke up the next morning to find his room empty and her parents crying in the kitchen, she'd pressed that flower between the pages of her diary and sworn to herself that she would keep his promise, no matter how long it took. 23 years later, she was still keeping it. The autumn morning when everything changed started like any other. Aroha arrived at the council office at 7:30, made her tea, and settled at her desk to review the day's planning applications. The morning light was soft and golden, filtering through the windows and casting long shadows across the office floor. By 9 o'clock, her colleagues had arrived, filling the space with the usual chatter about weekend plans and weather reports. At 10, they gathered in the conference room for their weekly staff meeting, a routine discussion about upcoming projects and budget allocations. Aroha sat at the far end of the table, her satchel hanging from the back of her chair, half listening to the familiar voices discussing road maintenance and building permits. She was thinking about her brother, as she often did during these meetings, wondering where he might be now, whether he ever thought about that promise they'd made by the sea. She didn't notice when her colleague, Jenny Morrison, reached across the table to grab a stack of files from the cabinet behind Aroha's chair. Didn't see the strap of her satchel catch on Jenny's sleeve. But she heard the soft thud as her bag hit the floor. Heard the scatter of coins and papers and small, precious things spreading across the conference room carpet. "Oh, God, Aroha, I'm so sorry," Jenny said, dropping to her knees to gather the scattered contents. "Let me help you." "No, it's fine, really," Aroha said quickly, but it was too late. The room had gone silent. Everyone was staring at the items on the floor, at the old photograph that had slipped from its protective envelope, and the dried pōhutukawa flower that lay beside it like a small, broken wing. Jenny picked up the photograph, her expression changing as she looked at it. "Aroha, who is this?" In the photo, 2 children stood on a beach at sunset. A teenage boy with kind eyes and an easy smile, his arm around a younger girl with long dark hair. Both of them were laughing at something beyond the camera's frame, their faces lit with the golden light of a summer evening that felt like it could last forever. "That's..." Aroha's voice caught in her throat. She reached for the photo, but Jenny was already studying it more closely. "This boy," Jenny said slowly. "He looks familiar. When was this taken?" "A long time ago," Aroha whispered. But the room was too quiet now. Too many eyes were looking at the photograph, at the flower, at Aroha's face as she carefully gathered the pieces of her broken privacy. Mark Stevens, who'd worked in local government for over 30 years, leaned forward to get a better look. His face went pale. "Aroha," he said quietly, "is this your brother?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Aroha clutched the photo to her chest, feeling the weight of 23 years of silence pressing down on her shoulders. "He disappeared," she said finally. "When we were children." From Aotearoa. "Aroha Taumalolo," Mark breathed. "I remember now. There were posters, searches, your family was from up the coast, right?" Aroha nodded, unable to speak. The room was spinning around her, all those years of careful privacy crumbling in the space of a heartbeat. "But Aroha," Jenny said gently, still holding pieces of the scattered contents. "Why haven't you ever mentioned this? We could have helped, we could have." "Because everyone gave up," Aroha said, her voice stronger now, edged with something that had been building for decades. Everyone except me. She stood up slowly, straightening her back, and began to speak, not in the halting whispers her colleagues were used to, but with the clear, steady voice of someone who had been carrying a story too heavy for one person to bear alone. His name was Tama, she said. He was 16 when he disappeared. Everyone said he ran away, said he was troubled, said boys sometimes just leave and never come back. My parents, they grieved for a while, then they moved on. They had to. They couldn't live in the space between hope and despair forever. She picked up the pōhutukawa flower, holding it carefully in her palm. But the night before he disappeared, we walked on the beach together. He gave me this flower and made me promise that I would never stop believing we'd find each other again. Even if everyone else gave up, even if years passed. I was to keep this flower and remember that some promises are stronger than time. The room was absolutely silent now. Outside, the sounds of morning traffic and seagulls seemed to come from another world. So I kept my promise, Aroha continued. I carried his photo and his flower with me everywhere. I moved to Gisborne because it was the closest city to where he disappeared, close enough that if he ever came home, he might find me. I took this job because it gave me access to records, to missing person reports, to any information that might help me understand what happened to him. For 23 years. Jenny whispered. For 23 years, Aroha confirmed. I never married because, how could I build a life with someone when half of my heart was still waiting for my brother to come home? I never moved away, never stopped hoping, never let go of the promise I made to a 16-year-old boy who believed that love was stronger than loss. Mark Stevens was staring at the photograph with an expression Aroha couldn't read. Aroha, he said slowly, can I see that photo again? She hesitated, then handed it over. Mark studied it for a long moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. The background, he said. This beach, these rocks, this looks like it was taken near Talaga Bay, doesn't it? Yes, Aroha said. We spent a summer there with our grandmother before everything changed. I know this place, Mark said. My family had a park near there when my kids were young. We used to go there every Christmas. He paused, looking up at Aroha with something like wonder in his eyes. Aroha, I think I might have seen your brother. The words hit the room like a physical force. Aroha felt her knees go weak. What do you mean? Not recently, Mark said quickly. But years ago. Maybe 10, 12 years ago. I was at the Talaga Bay wharf with my son, and there was this young man there, older than a teenager, but he had the same face, the same smile. He was talking to some of the local fishermen, asking about work. Aroha's hands were shaking now. Are you sure? I'm not sure of anything, Mark said honestly. But the resemblance was striking. And he had this way of laughing, this easy, genuine laugh that reminded me of someone. I couldn't place it then, but looking at this photo now. Jenny Morrison had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement. Aroha, she said suddenly, my brother-in-law works for the police in Gisborne. He's been here for 15 years, dealt with plenty of missing person cases. What if we asked him to take another look at Tama's file? The case was closed years ago, Aroha said weakly. Cases can be reopened, Mark said firmly. especially when new information comes to light. What new information? Jenny said simply. Your story. The fact that you never gave up. Sometimes that's all it takes, one person who refuses to let go, who keeps asking questions until someone finally listens. That afternoon, Aroha found herself sitting in the Gisborne police station, telling Tama's story to Detective Sarah Williams. Jenny's brother-in-law, who had kind eyes and the patience to listen to 23 years of hope condensed into an hour-long conversation. The thing about missing person cases, Detective Williams said when Aroha had finished, is that they are never really closed. They are just set aside, waiting for new information, new leads, new reasons to take another look. She pulled up Tama's file on her computer, scrolling through reports and witness statements that Aroha had never been allowed to see. Your brother's case was classified as a voluntary disappearance, the detective explained. No signs of foul play, no indication that he was in immediate danger. Just a teenager who seemed to have left home of his own accord. But he wouldn't have left without telling me, Aroha said. We were close. He wouldn't have broken his promise. Detective Williams looked at her thoughtfully. Tell me about this promise again. Aroha explained about the pōhutukawa flower, about the walk on the beach, about Tama's certainty that they would find each other again no matter what happened. It's interesting, the detective said. Because according to the original investigation, your brother left behind most of his personal belongings. His clothes, his books, even his wallet. But she scrolled through the inventory list. No mention of any sentimental items. No photos, no letters, no keepsakes. If he was planning to start a new life somewhere, wouldn't he have taken something to remember his family by? Aroha felt her heart speed up. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe it's time to take another look at your brother's case. With fresh eyes, new technology, and... She smiled at Aroha. Someone who never stopped believing he was worth finding. Over the next few weeks, Detective Williams began the process of reopening Tama's case. She contacted police stations throughout the North Island, uploaded Tama's photo to missing person databases that hadn't existed in the early 2000s, and reached out to social workers and community organizations who might have encountered him over the years. Aroha went back to her quiet routine at the council office, but something had changed. Her colleagues treated her differently now, not with pity, but with a kind of respectful admiration. They'd seen her quiet strength, her unwavering loyalty, her refusal to give up on someone she loved. They'd witnessed the power of a promise kept, even when keeping it meant carrying the weight of uncertainty for over 2 decades. Jenny Morrison started eating lunch with her on the bench outside, sharing stories about her own family, asking gentle questions about Aroha's memories of Tama. Mark Stevens brought her newspaper clippings about successful missing person cases, proof that sometimes people really did come home after years of absence. And slowly, carefully, Aroha began to let other people into the space she'd kept sacred for her brother's memory. The call came on a Thursday morning in late autumn. Aroha was at her desk, reviewing planning applications, when Detective Williams phoned. Aroha, she said, and something in her voice made Aroha's heart stop. Can you come to the station? There's someone here I'd like you to meet. The drive to the police station felt like the longest journey of Aroha's life. Her hands were shaking as she parked, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts as she walked through the automatic doors and approached the front desk. Detective Williams was waiting for her, her face carefully neutral. "Aroha, I want you to know that we may not have found your brother," she said gently. "But we have found someone who knew him. Someone who has information about where he went, and why." She led Aroha to a small interview room where a man in his 50s sat at a table, his hands folded in front of him. He had weathered skin and kind eyes, the look of someone who'd spent his life working outdoors. "Aroha," Detective Williams said, "this is Pete Ngata. He's a fisherman from Talaga Bay. He contacted us after seeing Tama's photo on the missing person database." Peter stood up as Aroha entered the room, his expression gentle but serious. "Miss Taumalolo," he said quietly, "I'm sorry it's taken so long for us to meet." Aroha sat down across from him, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. "You knew my brother?" "I did," Peter said. "He worked on my boat for about 3 years, starting when he was maybe 17, 18 years old. Good worker. Quiet, respectful. He told me his name was Tom. I never knew his full name was Tama, never connected him to the missing person reports." 3 years? Aroha whispered. "He was here, in Talaga Bay, for 3 years. He was," Peter confirmed. "He lived in a small caravan behind my house. Paid his rent in work, mostly. He was troubled when he first arrived. Wouldn't talk about his family, wouldn't say where he came from. But he was a good kid. Honest. Hard-working." "What happened to him?" Aroha asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Peter's expression grew sad. "There was an accident," he said quietly. "About 12 years ago. We were out on the boat during a storm, bigger than we'd expected. A rogue wave hit us, and Tom, he was swept overboard." The room went completely silent. Aroha felt the world tilt sideways, felt 23 years of hope crumble like sand in her hands. "We searched for him," Peter continued. "The Coast Guard, local volunteers, everyone. But the sea was too rough, and by the time the weather cleared." He shook his head. "We never found his body." Aroha closed her eyes, feeling tears she'd held back for over 2 decades finally spilling down her cheeks. "But Miss Taumalolo," Peter said gently, "there's something else you need to know. Something Tom asked me to do, if anything ever happened to him." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wooden box, carved with traditional Maori patterns. He made this himself, during the long winter evenings. Said it contained things that belonged to his family, things that needed to go home if he couldn't. With trembling hands, Aroha opened the box. Inside, carefully wrapped in soft cloth, were dozens of items she recognized. A small jade pendant that had belonged to their grandmother. A photo of their parents on their wedding day. A letter addressed to Aroha in Tama's careful handwriting. And at the bottom of the box, pressed between sheets of tissue paper, a single pōhutukawa flower, still holding faint traces of red after all these years. Aroha picked up the letter, her vision blurred with tears. The envelope was addressed simply, "For my sister, who promised to wait." "He asked me to make sure this got to you," Peter said quietly. He said you'd understand what it meant. He said you were the only person who'd never stopped believing he was worth finding. With shaking hands, Aroha opened the letter and began to read. Aroha, if you're reading this, it means Peter kept his promise to me, just like I know you've kept your promise to us. I hope you still have the pōhutukawa flower I gave you that night on the beach, because I've kept one too, all these years, wherever I've been. I'm sorry I left without saying goodbye. I'm sorry I broke the first part of our promise by disappearing without explanation. But I want you to know that I never broke the second part. I never stopped believing we'd find each other again, even if it had to be in a different way than I planned. I left because I was scared, little sister. Scared of the expectations, scared of the responsibilities, scared of becoming the man everyone wanted me to be instead of figuring out who I actually was. I thought if I could just get away for a while, clear my head, find my own path. I thought I could come back stronger, better, ready to be the brother you deserved. But the longer I stayed away, the harder it became to come home. How do you explain years of absence? How do you walk back into a life you abandoned without hurting everyone all over again? So I stayed away, and I built a different life. A simple life, working on the sea, helping Peter with his boat, trying to become the kind of man who deserved the love of a sister who would keep a promise for 23 years. I've written you so many letters over the years, but I never sent them. I kept telling myself I needed to wait until I was ready, until I had something to offer, until I could explain myself properly, until I was worthy of your forgiveness. But I know now that worthy isn't something you become, it's something you are, simply by being loved. And I have been loved, Aroha. Every day, in every prayer, in every memory, in every pōhutukawa flower that reminded me of home. I know you've been waiting for me. I know you've been keeping your promise, even when everyone else gave up. And I want you to know that your love has been with me every single day, even when I was too scared to come home and claim it. You don't need to wait anymore, little sister. You don't need to carry my memory like a burden. You've already given me the greatest gift anyone can give. You believed I was worth finding, even when I didn't believe it myself. Live your life now. Fall in love. Build a family. Plant pōhutukawa trees and watch them bloom. Be happy in the way that I never learned how to be. And know that wherever I am, whatever comes next, I am grateful beyond words for a sister who kept her promise, who proved that some kinds of love really are stronger than time. Until we meet again on some distant shore. Tama. P.S. I kept the flower. Even at the end, I kept the flower. Aroha read the letter 3 times before she could speak. When she finally looked up, Peter was watching her with tears in his own eyes. He was going to come home, Peter said quietly. The week before the accident, he'd finally worked up the courage. He'd bought a bus ticket to Gisborne, planned to find you and try to explain. The letter, he wrote it as practice, to figure out what he wanted to say when he saw you again. But the storm came first, Aroha whispered. The storm came first, Peter agreed. But Miss Taumalolo, he died knowing he was loved. He died believing that somewhere, his sister was still keeping their promise. That has to count for something. Aroha held the letter against her chest, feeling the weight of 23 years of questions finally settling into something that resembled peace. He was right, she said softly. I never stopped believing he was worth finding. And now you have found him, Detective Williams said gently. Maybe not in the way you hoped, but you found him. A month later, on a clear autumn morning, Aroha stood on the cliffs above Talaga Bay, holding 2 pōhutukawa flowers, the one she'd carried for 23 years, and the one that had travelled home with Tama's letter. The funeral service had been small but meaningful. Pete Ngata was there, along with several other fishermen who'd known Tama during his years in Talaga Bay. Detective Williams came, and Jenny Morrison, and Mark Stevens, and a dozen other people who'd been touched by the story of a sister who never gave up, and a brother who never stopped believing in love. They'd buried an empty coffin in the small cemetery overlooking the sea, with a headstone that read simply, Aroha Taumalolo. Beloved son and brother. Found at last. Now, standing alone on the cliffs where the pōhutukawa trees were just beginning to bloom, Aroha felt something she hadn't experienced in over 2 decades, the quiet peace of a promise fulfilled. She'd kept her word. She'd never stopped believing. And in the end, that belief had been enough to bring Tama home, not in body, but in spirit, in truth, in the closure that had seemed impossible for so many years. The wind off the Pacific was warm and gentle, carrying the scent of salt and native flowers. Aroha opened her hands and let the 2 pōhutukawa flowers fall, watching them dance on the breeze before disappearing into the vast blue space between sky and sea. Until we meet again, she whispered, and for the first time in 23 years, she turned away from the horizon and began the journey home. Behind her, the pōhutukawa trees swayed in the wind, their red flowers bright against the sky like promises kept, like love that outlasts loss, like the unbreakable bond between a sister who refused to forget and a brother who never stopped believing they would find each other again. She still walks the early morning streets of Gisborne, but now her steps are lighter, now her eyes look forward as often as they gaze toward the sea. She's learned to live in the present while carrying the past with grace, to build new memories while honoring old promises, to understand that love doesn't always give us what we expect, but it always gives us what we need. And sometimes, on quiet autumn mornings when the light is just right, people say you can see her smiling at something only she can see, something that looks like peace, like completion, like a sister who finally knows her brother made it home. Have you ever kept a promise in silence, just waiting for the right moment to share it?